The machines were beeping steadily around me, my chest rising and falling with deliberate effort as tubes snaked across my bruised body. I could barely move without sending sharp pain through my broken ribs, and every breath felt like swallowing glass. That's when my mother leaned over my hospital bed, her voice gentle but firm, and said the words that would change everything between us forever. "Maya, sweetheart, we can't cancel the Cabo trip. The doctors say you're stable now, and we've already invested so much money. Ashley's graduation celebration has been planned for months." As her words sank in, I realized I was about to spend the most terrifying week of my life completely alone, while my family sipped margaritas on a beach 2,000 miles away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Hi everyone, I'm Maya, and if you'd told me 6 months ago that being abandoned in an ICU would become the catalyst for the best decision I ever made, I would have thought you were crazy. But sometimes life has a twisted way of showing you exactly what you need to see, even when it's the last thing you want to acknowledge. This is the story of how my family's complete disregard for my well-being during the scariest moment of my life became the wake-up call that saved me from a lifetime of being their afterthought. I should probably start by explaining who I am and how I ended up in this situation. I'm 26 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life being the family peacekeeper, the one who smooths over conflicts and makes everyone else comfortable, often at the expense of my own needs. I work as a freelance graphic designer here in Denver, Colorado, which means my schedule is flexible enough that I'm usually available whenever my family needs something. My parents, Linda and Robert, have always been the type who project this perfect family image on social media, while the reality behind closed doors is much more complicated. My sister Ashley is 23, fresh out of college with a degree in marketing and a personality that demands to be the center of attention wherever she goes. She's always been the golden child, the one whose achievements get celebrated with elaborate parties and whose problems get immediate family mobilization. My brother Tyler just turned 21 and graduated from Colorado State with a business degree. He's always been Mom's obvious favorite, the son who could do no wrong, whose every accomplishment deserves a family vacation or expensive gift. Then there's me, the middle child who learned early that keeping everyone happy meant keeping myself small. I've spent years being the one who remembers everyone's birthdays, who organizes family gatherings, who listens to everyone's problems, and offers solutions I never get in return. I thought this was normal family dynamics until that Tuesday morning when everything changed. It was March 15th, a perfectly ordinary Tuesday that started like any other. I was driving to meet a potential client for coffee, taking my usual route down Spear Boulevard, when a delivery truck ran a red light and slammed into the driver's side of my Honda Civic. The impact sent my car spinning across 2 lanes of traffic before it crashed into a concrete barrier. I remember the sound of metal crushing and glass shattering, and then everything went black. When I woke up 3 days later in the ICU at Presbyterian Medical Center, I could barely remember my own name. The doctors explained that I'd suffered severe internal bleeding, 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and extensive bruising throughout my torso. They'd performed emergency surgery to stop the bleeding and had been monitoring me around the clock to ensure there were no complications. The first face I saw when I opened my eyes was my mother's, and for a moment, I felt this overwhelming relief that I wasn't alone. That first evening, my entire family gathered around my hospital bed. Dad sat in the uncomfortable chair by the window, scrolling through his phone occasionally, but mostly just looking worried. Mom fussed over my blankets and kept asking the nurses questions about my medication schedule. Ashley perched on the edge of the bed, taking selfies with me while I was barely conscious. And Tyler stood awkwardly in the corner, clearly uncomfortable with the whole hospital environment. For those first few hours, I felt surrounded by love and support. Mom promised she'd stay with me every day until I was released. Dad talked about taking time off work to help with my recovery. Ashley mentioned postponing some of her post-graduation plans to make sure I had company during the healing process. I felt grateful and loved, assuming that this traumatic experience would actually bring our family closer together. But the next morning, everything shifted. I woke up to find Mom sitting in the chair beside my bed, but instead of the concerned, nurturing presence I'd expected, she looked tense and conflicted. Dad was pacing by the window, occasionally stepping out to take phone calls that seemed to irritate him. When Ashley arrived around 10 in the morning, she was unusually quiet and kept exchanging meaningful glances with our parents. Finally, Mom took my hand and delivered the news that would crack something fundamental inside me. They had a family vacation planned to Cabo, San Lucas, Mexico, a trip they'd booked months earlier to celebrate Tyler's college graduation and Ashley's successful job interviews. The resort was non-refundable, the flights were already paid for, and they'd been planning this celebration for Tyler since Christmas. Mom explained that the doctors had assured them I was stable and out of immediate danger. The nurses were excellent, and I'd be in the best possible hands during my recovery. They would only be gone for 5 days, and by the time they returned, I'd probably be ready to go home anyway. Ashley chimed in that she'd been looking forward to this trip for months, that it was her reward for finishing college with honors, and that postponing it would devastate Tyler, who'd worked so hard for his degree. As I lay there listening to their rationalizations, I felt something cold settling in my chest. Not anger, exactly, but a creeping realization that I was hearing my family's true priorities spoken out loud for the first time. They weren't staying, because I needed them. They were leaving because Tyler's graduation celebration mattered more than my recovery from a near-fatal accident. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dad tried to soften the blow by promising they'd call every day to check on me. Mom assured me that she'd arranged for my best friend Sophia to visit regularly and that the nursing staff had her contact information for any emergencies. Ashley offered to bring me back souvenirs from Mexico, as if trinkets from their vacation could somehow compensate for their absence during the scariest experience of my life. The most devastating part wasn't even their decision to leave. It was how easily the decision had been made. There was no agonizing discussion about whether they should cancel the trip. No family meeting where they seriously weighed my needs against their vacation plans. They'd simply decided that since I wasn't dying anymore, their obligations to me had been fulfilled, and they were free to prioritize their own happiness. I watched them pack up their things that afternoon, promising to call from the airport and send photos from the resort. Tyler hugged me awkwardly and mumbled something about making it up to me when they got back. Ashley kissed my forehead and reminded me that she'd post updates on Instagram so I could see how much fun they were having. Mom lingered the longest, clearly feeling guilty, but not guilty enough to actually change their plans. After they left, the silence in my hospital room felt deafening. The machines continued their steady beeping. Nurses came and went with professional kindness. But the absence of my family created a hollow space that seemed to echo with all the years I'd spent, convincing myself that their love was conditional on my convenience. That first night alone, I cried until my ribs ached so badly I could barely breathe. Not just from physical pain, but from the crushing realization that I'd spent 26 years of my life believing I mattered to people who saw me as optional. I'd organized birthday parties for them, remembered their anniversaries, listened to their problems for hours, and supported their dreams unconditionally. But when I needed them most, when I was lying broken and scared in a hospital bed, they chose a vacation. Sophia arrived the next morning with coffee and pastries, her face dark with anger when she realized my family had actually gone through with their travel plans. She'd assumed they were joking when Ashley mentioned it on social media the night before. Seeing her genuine shock and outrage helped validate what I was feeling. This wasn't normal family behavior. This wasn't how people who love you react when you're hospitalized after a serious accident. The next few days blurred together in a haze of pain medication, physical therapy sessions, and slowly learning to move without feeling like my ribs were going to puncture my lungs. Sophia visited every day after work, bringing me books, magazines, and stories from the outside world. Nurse Patricia, who everyone called Patty, became like a surrogate mother figure, checking on me extra frequently, and always remembering exactly how I liked my coffee. It was Patty who helped me realize how twisted my normal family dynamic really was. She'd worked in hospitals for 15 years and had seen thousands of families navigate medical crises. According to her, most families would never consider leaving town while a loved one was hospitalized, regardless of vacation plans or financial investments. She told me about parents who slept in waiting room chairs for weeks, siblings who took extended leave from work, and spouses who practically moved into hospital rooms until their partners recovered. Meanwhile, my family was posting updates from their luxury resort in Cabo. Ashley shared Instagram stories of herself lounging by infinity pools, captioning them with quotes about deserving happiness and not letting family drama ruin special moments. Tyler posted photos of himself deep sea, fishing and playing volleyball on the beach. Mom uploaded family photos of the three of them at expensive restaurants, looking relaxed and joyful without any visible concern for my absence. The worst part was watching other people's reactions to their social media posts. Family, friends, and distant relatives started commenting with confusion, asking where I was and whether I was okay. A few people who knew about my accident left pointed comments asking why they were on vacation while I was hospitalized. Instead of addressing these concerns directly, my family simply stopped tagging our location and made their posts less obviously vacation-related. When Mom called to check on me the third day of their trip, I could hear mariachi music and laughter in the background. She asked about my pain levels and whether I was eating enough. But the conversation felt perfunctory, like an obligation she was fulfilling before returning to her fun. When I mentioned feeling lonely and scared, especially during the night when my pain was worst, she reminded me that the nurses were there if I needed anything, and that I should try to stay positive. That conversation was when something fundamental shifted inside me. Instead of the desperate sadness I'd been carrying, I felt a strange sense of clarity washing over me. My family had shown me exactly who they were and what I meant to them. They'd made their priorities crystal clear, and surprisingly, accepting that truth felt more peaceful than fighting against it. For the first time since the accident, I slept through the entire night without waking up anxious about my recovery or desperate for family contact. I stopped checking their social media posts obsessively and started focusing on my own healing process. When Dad called the next evening to ask if I needed anything from Mexico, I surprised myself by telling him I was fine and that they should enjoy the rest of their vacation. The change in my voice must have been noticeable because he asked if I was feeling okay, if the pain medication was affecting my mood. I assured him I was feeling better than I had in days, which was completely true. Accepting their abandonment had somehow freed me from the exhausting work of expecting them to be different than they were. Sophia noticed the change immediately when she visited that evening. Instead of finding me tearful and devastated, she discovered me reading a novel she'd brought, looking more relaxed than I'd been since the accident. When she asked about my improved mood, I tried to explain the strange peace that comes with finally seeing clearly. I told her it was like spending years trying to force a puzzle piece to fit in the wrong spot, and then suddenly realizing you'd been looking at the picture completely wrong. That night, alone in my hospital room with nothing but the sound of machines and distant hallway conversations, I started thinking seriously about my life choices for the first time in years. I'd been living as if my family's approval and inclusion were essential to my happiness. But their absence had proven that I could survive and even thrive without their constant presence. If anything, their dramatic disregard for my well-being had clarified exactly how little I'd been receiving from these relationships that I'd prioritized above everything else. I began to see patterns I'd been ignoring for decades. how I was always the one reaching out to maintain contact, how my problems were consistently minimized while theirs received immediate attention and resources, how my achievements were acknowledged briefly before conversations turned to their more interesting lives, how I'd learned to make myself small and undemanding to avoid conflict, never realizing that I'd become invisible in the process. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's worst behavior had accidentally become the catalyst for my liberation. By abandoning me so completely during my most vulnerable moment, they'd forced me to discover that I was stronger and more independent than I'd ever imagined. They'd inadvertently proven that their presence in my life wasn't the necessity I'd believed it to be. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement about my future and curiosity about who I might become if I stopped trying to earn love from people who weren't capable of giving it unconditionally. Little did I know that this realization was just the beginning of a transformation that would change everything about how I lived my life. The morning of day 4 brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Harrison, the surgeon who had performed my emergency operation, stopped by during his rounds with a stack of papers and a gentle smile. He explained that my recovery was progressing better than expected and that he wanted to discuss my discharge planning. As he spoke about physical therapy requirements and follow-up appointments, I realized he was assuming my family would be handling the coordination of my care. When I mentioned that they were currently in Mexico and wouldn't return for another 2 days, his expression shifted to confusion, then concern. He asked if I had other family members or close friends who could assist with my transition home, and I found myself explaining that Sophia was really my only reliable support system in Denver. The conversation felt humiliating, not because of my limited support network, but because Dr. Harrison's obvious bewilderment made it clear how abnormal my situation really was. After he left, I spent the afternoon scrolling through my laptop, catching up on work emails and trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. That's when I discovered an email that had been sitting in my inbox for 3 weeks, buried under client communications and family group chat notifications. It was from a design agency in Portland, Oregon, responding to a portfolio submission I'd made back in February and completely forgotten about in the chaos of daily life. The message was from Rebecca Walsh, the creative director at Cascade Design Studio. She apologized for the delayed response and explained that they'd been overwhelmed with applications for their senior graphic designer position. However, after reviewing my portfolio multiple times, they were impressed with my work and wanted to schedule a video interview. The position offered a significant salary increase, full benefits, and the opportunity to work on major Pacific Northwest tourism campaigns that aligned perfectly with my interests in outdoor recreation marketing. Reading that email felt like discovering a door I didn't even know existed. Before the accident, I probably would have immediately called my parents to discuss the opportunity, weighing the pros and cons with them and seeking their approval before moving forward. But lying there in that hospital bed, abandoned by the very people whose opinions I would have prioritized, I felt something entirely different. I felt curious about what I wanted, independent of anyone else's expectations or concerns. I responded to Rebecca that same afternoon, explaining my current medical situation honestly, but expressing strong interest in the position. I suggested we schedule the video interview for the following week, once I was discharged and had a few days to recover at home. Her response came within hours, warm and understanding, with genuine concern for my recovery and flexibility about timing that my own family hadn't shown. Meanwhile, the social media updates from Cabo continued with increasing frequency. Ashley had discovered the resort's professional photography services and was posting elaborately staged photos of herself in flowing sundresses against sunset backdrops. The captions grew more philosophical each day, with quotes about embracing joy and not allowing negative energy to dim your light. One post featured her holding a tropical drink with the caption, "Sometimes you have to choose your own happiness over other people's drama. Grateful for this reminder to prioritize my peace." The irony was staggering. While I lay in a hospital bed recovering from surgery, my sister was posting inspirational content about choosing happiness over drama, as if my near-fatal accident was some kind of personal inconvenience she'd courageously overcome. The comments from her friends were equally tone-deaf, praising her for being so wise and not letting family stress ruin her special time. Tyler's posts were less frequent, but equally revealing. He shared photos of deep-sea fishing excursions and beach volleyball games, always tagging the location and thanking mom and dad for the most epic graduation celebration ever. Not once did any of their posts acknowledge my absence or express hope for my recovery. To anyone following their social media, it would appear that their family was simply 3 people enjoying a perfect vacation together. The contrast between their social media presence and reality became even more apparent when Mom called that evening. I could hear resort entertainment in the background as she asked about my pain levels and medication schedule. When I mentioned feeling isolated and struggling with nighttime anxiety, she suggested I ask the nurses for something to help me sleep better. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes before she said she needed to go because they had dinner reservations at the resort's premier restaurant. After hanging up, I stared at the ceiling for a long time, processing the growing distance I felt from these people I'd spent my entire life trying to please. It wasn't anger exactly, but something closer to anthropological fascination. I was observing their behavior with the detachment of someone studying a foreign culture, trying to understand motivations and patterns that no longer affected me personally. Patty knocked softly and entered with my evening medication, noticing my contemplative mood. She'd been working the night shift for most of my stay and had become someone I looked forward to seeing. Unlike my family's performative concern, her care felt genuine and uncomplicated. She remembered details about my preferences, asked follow-up questions about things I'd mentioned days earlier, and treated my recovery as genuinely important rather than an inconvenience to be managed. As she checked my vital signs, I found myself telling her about the job opportunity in Portland. Her face lit up with excitement that felt more authentic than any response I'd received from my family about anything in recent memory. She asked thoughtful questions about the company, the type of work I'd be doing, and what I knew about living in Portland. When I mentioned that I'd always wanted to live somewhere with better access to hiking and outdoor activities, she shared stories about her daughter who'd moved to Seattle and loved the Pacific Northwest lifestyle. The conversation reminded me of dreams I'd put on hold indefinitely while maintaining my role as the family's emotional caretaker. I'd always wanted to live in a city with more creative opportunities and outdoor recreation, but I'd convinced myself that staying close to family was more important than pursuing personal goals. Now, lying in a hospital bed that they'd found easy to leave behind, those sacrifices seemed pointless rather than noble. That night, I couldn't sleep despite the pain medication. Instead of anxiety about my recovery or loneliness about my family's absence, I felt energized by possibilities I was allowing myself to consider for the first time in years. I spent hours researching Portland neighborhoods, looking at apartment listings, and reading about the city's design community. The more I learned, the more excited I became about the prospect of starting fresh somewhere that held no history, of me making myself small to keep others comfortable. The next morning brought another Instagram story from Ashley that crystallized something important for me. She'd posted a photo of herself at a spa, getting a massage with rose petals scattered around the table. The caption read, "Self-Care Sunday." Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is put yourself first and ignore the guilt trips from people who want to steal your joy. The phrase, "guilt trips from people who want to steal your joy," hit me like a physical blow. In Ashley's mind, my injury and recovery weren't legitimate needs deserving family support. They were manipulation tactics designed to ruin her vacation. She'd reframed their abandonment of me as self-care, positioning my pain as an attack on her happiness rather than a medical crisis requiring their presence. I screenshot the post and stared at it for several minutes, feeling pieces of my worldview rearranging themselves permanently. This wasn't a temporary lapse in judgment or a difficult decision they'd made reluctantly. This was their genuine perspective on my value relative to their comfort. I was the guilt trip. I was the joy stealer. I was the negative energy they needed to protect themselves from. Instead of devastation, I felt clarity. They'd shown me exactly how they saw me, and accepting that truth was far less exhausting than continuing to hope they'd eventually see me differently. I deleted Ashley from my social media accounts not out of anger, but out of practical self-preservation. Why continue exposing myself to content designed to make me feel guilty for having needs? Dr. Harrison returned that afternoon with my discharge paperwork, pleased with my progress and confident about my recovery timeline. He explained the physical therapy schedule and follow-up appointments, then asked again about my support system at home. When I told him my family would be returning from vacation the next day, he nodded approvingly, clearly relieved that I wouldn't be managing my recovery entirely alone. I didn't correct his assumption that their return meant they'd be helpful or present. I'd learned enough about their priorities to know that their physical presence wouldn't necessarily translate to emotional support or practical assistance. But I also realized that their inadequacy no longer felt like my emergency to solve. If they weren't capable of being the family I needed, that was information about them, not a reflection of my worth. Sophia arrived that evening with discharge planning supplies she'd researched online. She'd created a detailed schedule for my medication, printed out physical therapy exercises, and even brought a small cooler stocked with easy-to-prepare meals for my first few days at home. Her thoroughness highlighted the contrast with my family's approach to my care, but instead of making me feel sadder about their neglect, it made me feel grateful for the relationship I did have. As we organized everything for my return home, I told Sophia about the Portland job opportunity. Her reaction was immediate and enthusiastic, asking why I hadn't mentioned it sooner and insisting that I absolutely had to pursue it. When I expressed concerns about leaving Denver and starting over in a new city, she looked at me with gentle exasperation and asked what exactly I thought I'd be leaving behind. The question stopped me cold because I couldn't articulate a compelling answer. My freelance work was location independent. My social life revolved primarily around Sophia and a few other friends who would remain connected regardless of geography. My family had demonstrated their indifference to my presence so dramatically that my absence would probably be a relief rather than a loss. What was I clinging to besides familiarity and fear? That night, my last night in the hospital, I lay awake thinking about the person I'd been before the accident versus who I was becoming through this experience. The old Maya would have spent this week desperately trying to guilt her family into returning early, then minimizing her own hurt to preserve family harmony once they came back. She would have accepted their explanations and excuses, grateful for any attention, rather than demanding the consideration she deserved. But this Maya, the one who'd been forced to confront her family's true priorities, felt different. Stronger, maybe, but also more honest about what she was and wasn't willing to accept from people who claimed to love her. The accident had broken more than just my ribs. It had shattered illusions I'd been maintaining about relationships that were fundamentally imbalanced. I thought about Rebecca's email and the Portland opportunity, imagining myself in a city where nobody knew me as the accommodating middle child who absorbed everyone else's chaos, where I could establish relationships based on mutual respect rather than inherited family dynamics, where my needs wouldn't be automatically secondary to everyone else's preferences. The idea felt both terrifying and exhilarating. For 26 years, I'd defined myself primarily in relation to my family's expectations and needs. Moving across the country to pursue my own goals would mean discovering who I was when I wasn't constantly managing other people's emotions or minimizing my own requirements to keep peace. As dawn approached, I realized I'd made a decision without consciously choosing. I was going to take the Portland interview seriously. I was going to consider the possibility that my life could be fundamentally different than it had always been. I was going to stop treating my family's neglect as a problem I needed to solve and start treating it as information I needed to act on. The morning sun streaming through my hospital window felt symbolic of something ending and something else beginning. In a few hours, I'd be discharged to a home that felt less like sanctuary and more like a temporary stopping point. My family would return from their vacation refreshed and happy, probably expecting me to be grateful for their presence and eager to resume our normal dynamics. But I wouldn't be the same person they'd left behind. The Maya who'd absorbed their selfishness and made excuses for their emotional unavailability was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth, independent of their recognition. They'd return to find someone who no longer needed their approval to make decisions about her own life. I spent my final morning in the hospital video calling with Rebecca Walsh from Cascade Design Studio. Despite my medical gown and hospital room backdrop, the interview flowed naturally, focusing on my portfolio work and creative process rather than my current circumstances. She was impressed with my experience in outdoor recreation marketing and seemed genuinely excited about the possibility of me joining their team. By the time I hung up, I felt more energized and hopeful than I had in months, possibly years. Rebecca promised to follow up within a week with next steps, and I found myself hoping desperately that the position would work out. Not just for professional reasons, but because it represented the possibility of a life built around my own choices rather than my family's expectations. Patty stopped by during her shift change to say goodbye, bringing me a small succulent plant she'd picked up at the hospital gift shop. She said it reminded her of me because it was resilient and didn't require much external support to thrive. The gesture moved me to tears, not from sadness but from gratitude for unexpected kindness from someone who owed me nothing. As I prepared to leave the hospital that had become a strange sanctuary, I felt ready to face whatever came next. My family would return expecting to find me grateful and diminished, eager to resume my role as their emotional support system. Instead, they'd discover someone who'd learned to value herself enough to consider other options. The woman they'd left behind in that hospital bed was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that being alone was preferable to being with people who made you feel alone. They'd inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible, the clarity to see our relationships as they truly were, and the courage to imagine something better. Sophia drove me home from the hospital in comfortable silence, occasionally glancing over to check how I was handling the transition from sterile medical environment to the familiar chaos of Denver traffic. My apartment felt smaller than I remembered, cluttered with the remnants of a life I'd been living on autopilot for years. Mail had piled up on my kitchen counter, plants drooped from neglect, and everything carried the stale air of a space abandoned mid-routine. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it felt without the constant background noise of hospital machinery and hallway conversations. The silence wasn't peaceful, though. It felt expectant, like the apartment was waiting for me to resume being the person who'd left it 8 days earlier. But that person felt like a stranger now, someone whose priorities and tolerances I could barely remember or understand. Sophia helped me settle into my bedroom, arranging my medication schedule and ensuring I had everything within reach to minimize unnecessary movement. She'd stocked my refrigerator with prepared meals and left detailed notes about when to take which pills and how to contact her if complications arose. Her care felt both foreign and wonderful after days of managing my family's emotional absence while simultaneously dealing with physical recovery. As she prepared to leave, Sophia hesitated at my front door, clearly wanting to say something but unsure how to phrase it. Finally, she turned back and asked if I was really okay being alone, especially with my family due back that evening. The question surprised me because I realized I was actually looking forward to the solitude. After a week of nurses, doctors, and phone calls from people who felt obligated to check on me, the prospect of genuine quiet felt like luxury rather than isolation. I assured her I was fine, and for the first time in our friendship, I could tell she believed me completely. There was something different in my voice, a calmness that hadn't been there before the accident. She hugged me carefully, mindful of my still tender ribs, and promised to call the next morning to check on my first night home. Once alone, I wandered slowly through my apartment, seeing it with fresh perspective. The walls were covered with family photos spanning decades, documenting holidays, graduations, birthdays, and random gatherings. In almost every image, I noticed the same pattern. I was positioned slightly outside the main group, smiling, but somehow separate from the core family unit of my parents and siblings. There was my high school graduation photo, where Tyler had positioned himself directly between Mom and Dad, while Ashley stood on Dad's other side, leaving me awkwardly balanced. On the far edge of the frame, our last Christmas picture showed similar positioning, with me holding a gift I'd carefully selected for everyone else while they clustered together around presents that clearly hadn't required much thought or consideration. The most telling photo was from Ashley's college graduation 2 years earlier. The family had traveled to Boulder for her ceremony, and I'd spent the entire weekend managing logistics, making dinner reservations, and ensuring everyone's needs were met. In the photo, taken by a passing stranger, Ashley glowed in her cap and gown surrounded by our beaming parents, while I stood slightly behind them, holding Ashley's purse and looking more like hired help than a beloved family member. Looking at these images now, I could see the dynamic I'd been unconsciously participating in for years. I was always the facilitator, the organizer, the one ensuring everyone else's comfort while making myself invisible in the process. The photos documented decades of me choosing to fade into the background, mistaking self-erasure for family harmony. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom announcing their flight had landed, and they'd be stopping by my apartment within the hour. The message was brief and matter-of-fact, lacking any acknowledgement of the week I'd spent recovering alone or curiosity about my current condition. It read like a scheduling update rather than communication from someone who'd missed me or worried about my well-being while enjoying tropical beaches. I used the time before their arrival to shower carefully and change into comfortable clothes that didn't immediately scream recent surgery patient. Not because I wanted to hide my recovery process, but because I preferred to control the narrative of our reunion rather than letting my appearance drive their emotional response. I'd learned enough about their priorities to know that making them comfortable was always my responsibility, regardless of my own circumstances. When they arrived, the energy felt exactly as I'd expected. Ashley burst through my door with arms full of shopping bags, immediately launching into animated descriptions of their resort adventures, while Tyler followed behind, looking slightly uncomfortable with the transition from vacation mode back to family obligation. Mom and Dad entered last, carrying themselves with the relaxed demeanor of people who'd spent a week being pampered rather than worried. The apartment filled quickly with vacation souvenirs, duty-free purchases, and stories. That seemed to require my enthusiastic participation despite my obvious absence from all the experiences they were describing. Ashley had bought me a silver bracelet with turquoise stones that looked like something designed for tourists, rather than selected with any knowledge of my personal style. Tyler handed me a bottle of expensive tequila, seemingly forgetting that. I rarely drink and definitely shouldn't be mixing alcohol with my current medication regimen. Mom presented me with a hand-woven scarf that smelled like resort gift shop and felt scratchy against my skin. Dad offered a coffee table book about Mexican architecture that would have been perfect for someone interested in design, except that he'd apparently forgotten my actual profession was graphic design, not architecture. Each gift felt like evidence of how little they actually knew about my preferences or interests. As they unpacked their offerings and settled into my living room, I observed their behavior with the same detached curiosity I'd developed in the hospital. They were performing the ritual of family reunion without any acknowledgement of the context that made this particular gathering unusual. No one asked about my surgery recovery, my pain levels, or how I'd managed the psychological challenge of being hospitalized alone. Instead, Ashley immediately began showing me photos on her phone, swiping through hundreds of images that documented every meal, every sunset, and every perfectly curated moment of their vacation. She narrated each photo with infectious enthusiasm, describing the resort's amenities, the quality of their spa treatments, and the interesting people they'd met at various bars and restaurants. The photos painted a picture of 5 days filled with relaxation, luxury, and family bonding that had apparently required no effort to enjoy, despite leaving their injured daughter behind. They looked genuinely happy in every image, with no visible signs of worry or guilt about my absence. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. These were people capable of profound joy and connection, just not with me included. Tyler jumped in, with stories about their deep-sea fishing expedition, describing in detail the massive marlin he'd caught and the celebration dinner that followed. He seemed genuinely excited to share these experiences with me, but there was no awareness that his enthusiasm might be painful for someone who'd been excluded from family bonding due to medical emergency. His joy felt authentic, but completely disconnected from any consideration of my feelings about missing these moments. Mom and Dad settled into familiar roles, with Dad handling the practical aspects of their return, like unpacking and organizing receipts, while Mom managed the emotional labor of ensuring everyone felt included in the storytelling. She made sure I had a comfortable seat, offered to make tea, and asked gentle questions about my recovery that felt perfunctory rather than genuinely concerned. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone, with everyone contributing memories and observations about their shared experience while I listened from the position of permanent outsider. Not once did anyone acknowledge the strangeness of describing a family vacation to the family member who'd been excluded due to circumstances beyond her control. Not once did anyone express regret about my absence or curiosity about my experience while they were gone. As the evening progressed, I found myself studying their faces and body language with fascination rather than hurt. They were genuinely comfortable with the situation, completely at peace with their decision to prioritize vacation over family crisis. There was no underlying guilt or discomfort that might suggest they understood the impact of their choice. They simply didn't see my hospitalization as something that should have interfered with their plans. The most revealing moment came when Ashley mentioned meeting another family at the resort who'd had to cancel their trip due to a medical emergency back home. She described feeling sorry for them, but also relieved that our family hadn't had to make such a difficult choice. The irony was apparently lost on her completely. We had made that exact choice. They'd simply chosen differently than the family she pitied. When Mom finally asked about my recovery, her questions focused on logistics rather than emotional impact. She wanted to know about my medication schedule, physical therapy requirements, and timeline for returning to normal activities. There was no curiosity about how I'd felt being alone during the scariest medical experience of my life. No acknowledgement of the courage it had taken to manage everything independently. No recognition that their absence might have created psychological wounds alongside the physical ones. I answered her questions calmly and thoroughly, providing the information she needed without offering additional details about my emotional experience. Something had shifted in me during their absence, a fundamental change in how much emotional labor I was willing to provide for people who offered so little in return. I no longer felt compelled to help them process their guilt or make them feel better about their choices. Dad mentioned that they'd talked about me frequently during the trip, expressing concern about my recovery and debating whether they should cut their vacation short. This revelation hit me like a physical blow, because it meant they'd consciously chosen to continue their vacation despite feeling worried. They'd weighed my needs against their desires and deliberately chosen their own comfort. It wasn't thoughtless neglect, but calculated prioritization. As they prepared to leave that evening, promising to check on me regularly and help with anything I needed during recovery, I felt something crystallizing inside me. Their concern felt hollow now that I understood it was conditional and convenience-based. They were willing to help as long as it didn't significantly inconvenience them or interfere with their own plans and preferences. Tyler hugged me goodbye and mentioned how glad he was that I'd been okay while they were gone, as if my recovery had been a foregone conclusion rather than something requiring effort and support. Ashley kissed my cheek and reminded me to call if I needed anything, but her offer felt performative rather than genuine. Mom lingered longest, clearly sensing that something was different about my demeanor, but unable to identify what had changed. After they left, I sat in my quiet apartment surrounded by their gifts and souvenirs, feeling more alone than I had during any moment of my actual solitude in the hospital. Their visit had clarified something important. Being physically present with people who fundamentally don't understand or prioritize your well-being is far more isolating than being genuinely alone. I spent the rest of that evening organizing the gifts they'd brought me, recognizing them as symbols of obligation rather than affection. The bracelet, tequila, scarf, and book represented their desire to check the box of caring family member, without investing the emotional energy required to actually know what would make me feel valued or understood. That night, I called Rebecca Walsh at Cascade Design Studio, despite the late hour and my recent discharge from the hospital. She answered immediately, her voice warm with concern when I explained my medical situation and apologized for any confusion about my availability. When I told her I was definitely interested in pursuing the position and could be available for in-person interviews within 2 weeks, her enthusiasm felt more genuine than anything I'd experienced from my family all evening. We talked for over an hour about the company culture, Portland's design community, and the specific projects I'd be working on if hired. Rebecca's interest in my ideas and perspective felt validating in a way that my family's dutiful concern never had. She treated me like someone whose contributions mattered rather than someone whose needs were inconvenient but manageable. After hanging up, I realized I'd spent more time that evening discussing my professional future with a virtual stranger than my family had spent asking about my recovery experience. The contrast felt like a neon sign pointing toward the kind of relationships I deserved versus the ones I'd been accepting out of habit and fear. I fell asleep that night thinking about Portland's creative community, wondering what it would feel like to live somewhere that nobody expected me to be anything other than exactly who I was. For the first time since the accident, I felt excited about my future rather than resigned to my circumstances. My family's visit had accomplished something they'd never intended. It had shown me exactly what I needed to leave behind to build the life I actually wanted. The next morning brought a follow-up call from Mom, checking on my first night home and offering to bring groceries or help with housework. Her offer was kind and practical, but it felt like compensation for guilt rather than genuine care. I thanked her and declined, explaining that Sophia had already stocked my refrigerator and that I preferred to manage my recovery independently. Mom's surprise at my self-sufficiency was telling. She'd expected to find me grateful for any attention, eager to accept help that would allow her to feel better about their vacation choice. Instead, she discovered someone who'd learned to value autonomy over accommodation, someone who no longer needed their validation to feel worthy of care and consideration. As I prepared for my first full day back in my own space, I felt ready for whatever came next. My family had shown me who they truly were during my most vulnerable moment, and I'd discovered I was strong enough to handle that truth. More importantly, I'd realized that their limitations didn't have to define the boundaries of my own life. Portland was starting to feel less like an escape and more like a homecoming to a version of myself I'd never had the courage to become. The following week passed in a blur of physical therapy appointments, medication schedules, and an unexpected surge of creative energy that surprised me more than anyone. Despite my healing ribs and lingering fatigue, I found myself working on design projects with more focus and passion than I'd experienced in months. It was as if removing the constant background anxiety of managing my family's emotions had freed up mental space I didn't even know I'd been using. Rebecca called on Thursday with news that made my heart race. Cascade Design Studio wanted to offer me the senior graphic designer position with a starting salary that was 30% higher than what I'd been making freelancing in Denver. The benefits package included full health coverage, 3 weeks paid vacation, and a professional development budget that would allow me to attend design conferences and workshops. Most importantly, she explained that the company culture prioritized work-life balance and genuine collaboration over competitive dynamics. As Rebecca described the team I'd be joining and the projects they had planned, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pure, uncomplicated excitement about my professional future. She mentioned that several team members were outdoor enthusiasts who organized weekend hiking trips and camping excursions, and that Portland's creative community was welcoming to newcomers who wanted to get involved in local arts initiatives. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, covering everything from relocation logistics to the specific campaigns I'd be working on during my first 6 months. Rebecca's enthusiasm felt infectious and genuine, so different from the polite interest my family had always shown in my work. When she asked if I needed time to consider the offer, I surprised myself by requesting just 48 hours to make my final decision. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment staring at the job offer email Rebecca had sent immediately following our call. The salary figure looked surreal compared to the financial uncertainty I'd grown accustomed to as a freelancer. The start date was flexible, allowing me time to recover fully and relocate properly. Everything about the opportunity felt like doors opening rather than compromises or sacrifices. That evening, Sophia arrived with takeout from my favorite Vietnamese restaurant, something my family had never remembered despite years of ordering it whenever she visited. As we ate spring rolls and pho, I told her about the Portland offer, watching her face light up with excitement that felt more enthusiastic than anything my own family had ever expressed about my achievements. Sophia's first question wasn't about what I'd be leaving behind, but about what I'd be gaining. She wanted to know about the company culture, the creative projects, and whether Portland's outdoor scene matched my interests. Her curiosity felt validating and practical, focused on my happiness rather than her convenience or comfort with my decisions. When I mentioned my hesitation about leaving Denver, Sophia gently challenged me to articulate what exactly I thought I'd be missing. As I tried to explain my concerns about distance from family, she reminded me of the week I'd just spent in the hospital, alone and unsupported despite being in the same city as people who claimed to love me. Her point was impossible to argue with because the evidence was so recent and undeniable. That night, I called my parents to tell them about the job offer, expecting some version of the conversation I'd had with Sophia. Instead, Mom's immediate response was concern about how my move would affect family gatherings and holiday traditions. Dad worried about the expense of visiting me in Portland and whether I'd fully considered the financial implications of relocating across the country. Neither parent asked about the job itself, the company culture, or whether the opportunity aligned with my professional goals. Their questions focused entirely on how my decision would impact them, as if my career advancement was primarily significant for its effect on their convenience. When I described the salary increase and benefits package, Mom seemed more concerned about whether success would change my personality than proud of my professional achievement. The conversation felt like a perfect encapsulation of our family dynamic. My needs and opportunities were always filtered through the lens of how they affected everyone else's comfort and preferences. Even career advancement that would improve. My financial security and professional satisfaction was somehow reframed as a potential problem for them to manage. Tyler called the next day with his own concerns about my potential move. He'd been planning to ask me to help with some freelance marketing work for a friend's startup, and my relocation would complicate those plans. He suggested I could probably find similar opportunities in Denver without the hassle of moving, completely missing the point that I wanted more than just similar opportunities. I wanted different opportunities, in a different place, surrounded by different people who didn't see my growth as their inconvenience. Ashley's response was the most telling of all. When I mentioned the Portland offer during our coffee date, that weekend, she immediately launched into concerns about how my absence would affect family dynamics. She worried that Mom would be sad without all her children nearby, that holiday gatherings would feel incomplete, and that I might become disconnected from family traditions that had always been important to our identity. Not once did Ashley express excitement about my professional opportunity, or curiosity about what the move might mean for my personal happiness. Her entire focus was on preservation of existing family structures, regardless of whether those structures actually served everyone's best interests. The irony was staggering, coming from someone who'd spent our family's crisis posting about choosing personal happiness over obligation. As I listened to Ashley's concerns, I realized she was describing exactly the family disconnection I'd already experienced during my hospital stay. She was worried about hypothetical future distance that might result from my moving to Portland, while completely ignoring the emotional distance that already existed despite our geographic proximity. Physical presence hadn't translated to emotional support when I'd needed it most. The contrast between my family's response to my job offer and Sophia's enthusiasm clarified something important about the relationships I'd been prioritizing. Sophia celebrated my opportunities because she wanted me to be happy and successful. My family questioned my opportunities because they wanted me to remain available and accommodating. The difference wasn't subtle. That weekend, I spent hours researching Portland neighborhoods and apartment complexes, imagining myself in a city where nobody expected me to be anything other than exactly who I was. I looked at hiking trails within driving distance, farmers markets where I could buy fresh produce, and coffee shops where I could work on weekend projects without running into people who knew me as the accommodating middle child. The more I learned about Portland, the more it felt like a place where I could discover parts of myself that had been dormant for years. I'd always loved outdoor activities, but rarely pursued them because family obligations consumed most of my weekend time. I'd always wanted to be more involved in local arts communities, but had never prioritized those interests over family expectations. Monday morning brought my 48-hour deadline for responding to Rebecca's offer. I woke up knowing exactly what I wanted to do, but I decided to have one final conversation with my parents before making my decision official. I invited them over for dinner, planning to cook a meal that would create a comfortable environment for discussing my future plans. As I prepared their favorite dishes, I found myself thinking about all the family dinners I'd hosted over the years, always focused on making everyone else comfortable while minimizing my own needs and preferences. This dinner felt different because I was no longer trying to manage their emotional responses or seek their approval. I was simply informing them of a decision I'd already made. When they arrived that evening, the conversation started pleasantly enough, with updates about their post-vacation routines and questions about my recovery progress. But when I formally announced my intention to accept the Portland position and move within 6 weeks, the mood shifted dramatically. Mom's face crumpled with what looked like genuine grief, as if I'd announced a terminal diagnosis rather than a career advancement. She began listing all the reasons why leaving Denver would be a mistake, from practical concerns about moving expenses to emotional arguments about family loyalty and the importance of staying close to people who loved me. Dad's response was more pragmatic, but equally focused on deterring my decision. He questioned whether I'd thoroughly researched Portland's cost of living, job market stability, and social opportunities for single women in their 20s. His concerns felt patronizing rather than protective, as if he couldn't trust me to make informed decisions about my own life. As they voiced their objections, I realized they were reacting to my independence rather than my geographic relocation. The specific city wasn't the problem. The problem was that I was making a major life decision without prioritizing their preferences or seeking their permission. They were losing control over my choices, and that loss felt threatening to the family dynamic they'd grown comfortable with. I listened to their concerns calmly, acknowledging their feelings without changing my mind or offering to compromise. This was new territory for all of us because I'd never made a significant decision that prioritized my well-being over their comfort. They didn't know how to respond to this version of me, someone who valued their input without requiring their approval. The conversation continued for hours, cycling through different arguments and emotional appeals designed to change my mind. Mom tried guilt about leaving her children behind. Dad attempted logic about financial risks and career uncertainty. They tag-teamed between disappointment and concern, clearly hoping that enough pressure would convince me to reconsider. But something fundamental had changed in me during that week alone in the hospital. I'd discovered that I could survive and even thrive without their constant presence and approval. Their efforts to dissuade me only reinforced that moving to Portland was exactly the right decision for someone who wanted to live according to her own values rather than inherited family expectations. When they finally left that evening, clearly frustrated by their inability to change my mind, I felt nothing but relief. The conversation had confirmed that my family's love was conditional on my continued availability to serve their emotional needs. Moving to Portland wasn't just about career advancement. It was about discovering who I could become when I wasn't constantly managing other people's feelings. I called Rebecca the next morning and formally accepted the position, with a start date 6 weeks from that Monday. Her excitement felt like sunlight after months of clouds, and we spent an hour discussing relocation logistics and my first week schedule. She mentioned that the team was already planning a welcome lunch at their favorite food truck pod, and that several colleagues had offered to help me explore Portland neighborhoods during my first weekend in the city. The following weeks passed quickly as I organized my move and wrapped up freelance projects in Denver. Sophia threw me a farewell party that felt more like a celebration than a goodbye, with friends who were genuinely excited about my new adventure, rather than focused on their own loss. The contrast with my family's response was stark and telling. My parents made sporadic efforts to change my mind right up until my departure date, alternating between emotional manipulation and practical objections. But their resistance only strengthened my resolve, because it confirmed that they were more concerned about their own convenience than my happiness or professional growth. Ashley and Tyler's responses remained consistently self-focused, worried about how my absence would affect holiday arrangements and family gatherings, rather than excited about my opportunities in a new city. Their concerns felt like background noise because I'd stopped expecting them to celebrate my achievements or prioritize my well-being. The morning I loaded my belongings into a moving truck, only Sophia came to see me off. My family had made themselves unavailable, claiming various obligations that prevented them from saying goodbye in person. Their absence felt symbolic rather than hurtful, because it perfectly represented the emotional unavailability they demonstrated throughout my recovery. As I drove out of Denver toward my new life in Portland, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete freedom from other people's expectations about who I should be and what I should prioritize. The woman in that rearview mirror wasn't the accommodating middle child who'd spent 26 years making herself small to keep others comfortable. She was someone who'd learned to value her own needs enough to pursue opportunities that served her growth and happiness. Portland welcomed me with characteristic drizzle and surprising warmth from colleagues who seemed genuinely interested in my ideas and perspective. My first week at Cascade Design Studio exceeded every expectation, with projects that challenged me creatively and teammates who treated collaboration as genuine partnership rather than competition or obligation. The apartment I'd rented sight unseen turned out to be perfect, with large windows overlooking a tree-lined street and easy access to hiking trails that became my weekend sanctuary. Within a month, I'd joined a weekend hiking group, started attending poetry readings at local bookstores, and felt more socially connected than I had in years of living near family who rarely made time for meaningful interaction. My family calls, occasionally, usually when they need something or want to share news about their own lives. I'm polite, but no longer feel obligated to provide emotional labor for people who offer so little in return. They've begun to understand that I'm no longer available to absorb their chaos or minimize my own needs to maintain family harmony. The most surprising part of my transformation isn't the career success or geographic relocation. It's the discovery that I actually like myself when I'm not constantly trying to earn other people's approval. The woman who almost died in that car accident was someone who'd forgotten that her own happiness mattered. The woman who emerged from that experience knows exactly what she deserves from relationships and isn't willing to accept less. Sometimes, I think about that night in the ICU when my family chose vacation over my recovery, and instead of feeling hurt, I feel grateful. Their abandonment forced me to discover strengths I didn't know I possessed and showed me exactly what kind of relationships I wanted to build going forward. They inadvertently gave me the greatest gift possible: the clarity to see that being alone is infinitely better than being with people who make you feel alone. 6 months later, I'm designing campaigns for Pacific Northwest tourism initiatives, exploring waterfalls on weekend hiking trips, and building friendships with people who value authenticity over accommodation. My family's love was contingent on my availability to serve their needs. The relationships I'm building now are based on mutual respect and genuine interest in each other's well-being. The woman who begged for crumbs of attention from people who couldn't be bothered to visit her in the hospital is gone forever, replaced by someone who knows exactly what she's worth and refuses to settle for less. My family taught me an invaluable lesson, though not the one they intended. They showed me that sometimes the people who hurt you most end up setting you free in ways they never imagined. For that twisted gift, I'm actually grateful. Because the life I'm living now, surrounded by people who show up when it matters and celebrate my achievements without reservation, is worth every difficult moment it took to find the courage to choose myself over their comfort. 3 months into my Portland adventure, I received an unexpected phone call that would test every boundary I'd established since leaving Denver. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was sitting in my favorite coffee shop downtown working on a campaign for Oregon State Tourism Board when my phone buzzed with Mom's contact information. I almost declined the call, having learned to protect my peace from their unpredictable emotional demands. But something made me answer. Mom's voice sounded different, strained in a way that immediately put me on alert. She explained that Ashley had been in a minor car accident the previous day, nothing serious but enough to leave her shaken and requiring a few days of rest. Tyler was dealing with stress at his new job and had been having what Mom described as anxiety attacks. Dad's blood pressure had spiked during a routine checkup, and his doctor wanted him to reduce stress and monitor his health more closely. As Mom recounted these family challenges, I found myself automatically slipping into old patterns of thinking. My first instinct was to offer solutions, to coordinate care, to drop everything and return to Denver to manage the crisis. The pull was so strong it took conscious effort to resist the familiar role of family emergency coordinator that I'd occupied for so many years. But then Mom delivered the real purpose of her call. She asked if I could come home for a few weeks to help everyone get back on their feet. She painted a picture of a family in crisis who needed their reliable daughter to restore order and provide emotional support. She mentioned that Ashley had specifically asked for me, that Tyler was struggling to manage his anxiety alone, and that Dad would benefit from having his children nearby during his health scare. The request felt like a test of everything I'd learned about setting boundaries and prioritizing my own well-being. The old Maya would have been on a flight to Denver within hours, abandoning her own responsibilities to rescue family members from problems they were perfectly capable of handling themselves. But this Maya had spent months discovering what it felt like to live without constantly absorbing other people's chaos. I listened to Mom's appeal with sympathy, but without the automatic panic response that used to drive my decision-making. As she spoke, I realized she was describing temporary setbacks rather than genuine emergencies. Ashley's accident was minor with no lasting injuries. Tyler's anxiety was manageable with professional help that he could access independently. Dad's blood pressure concerns were exactly the kind of health maintenance issues that adults handle routinely. More importantly, I recognized the familiar pattern of my family treating their individual problems as collective crises that required my intervention. They'd learned over the years that presenting their issues as emergencies would motivate me to abandon my own priorities and rush to their aid. But I was no longer the person who believed that their inability to cope independently was my responsibility to fix. When Mom finished her appeal, I took a deep breath and responded with compassion but firmness. I expressed concern for each family member's situation and offered to help them connect with appropriate resources in Denver. I suggested therapists for Tyler's anxiety, reminded Mom that Ashley had friends and professional contacts who could provide support, and encouraged Dad to follow his doctor's recommendations for managing his blood pressure. But I made it clear that I wouldn't be returning to Denver to personally manage their recovery processes. I explained that I had professional commitments in Portland that I couldn't abandon, and that I'd learned to trust their ability to handle challenges without my direct intervention. The conversation grew tense as Mom realized I wasn't going to automatically comply with her request. She escalated her appeal, mentioning how much the family had done for me over the years, and suggesting that my refusal to help during their time of need was selfish and ungrateful. She brought up my hospital stay, ironically claiming that they'd been so supportive during my recovery that I owed them the same level of care during their current difficulties. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. She was invoking their support during my hospitalization as justification for my obligation to support them now, apparently having completely rewritten the history of that experience in her mind. According to this revised narrative, they'd been devoted and attentive during my recovery rather than absent and self-focused. I remained calm as I gently corrected her memory of my hospital experience, reminding her that they'd left for vacation the day after my surgery and spent my entire recovery period in Cabo San Lucas. I pointed out that I'd managed my medical crisis independently, proving that adults could handle difficult situations without family members dropping everything to provide rescue services. Mom's response revealed the depth of her investment in maintaining family dynamics that positioned me as the perpetual caretaker. She argued that their vacation hadn't prevented them from caring about my recovery, and that my current refusal to help was evidence of how much I'd changed since moving to Portland. She suggested that my new independence was actually selfishness disguised as personal growth. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Mom cycling through various emotional appeals designed to guilt me into compliance. She tried disappointment, claiming that she'd raised me to value family above personal convenience. She attempted manipulation, suggesting that my refusal would worsen Dad's blood pressure and increase Tyler's anxiety. She even tried bargaining, offering to pay for my flights and promising that I'd only need to stay for a week. But none of her strategies worked because I'd learned to distinguish between genuine emergencies and manufactured crises designed to maintain my role as family problem solver. Ashley's fender bender, Tyler's work stress, and Dad's routine health concerns were normal adult challenges that didn't require my intervention. Their inability to cope without my assistance was their problem to solve, not mine to fix. When I maintained my boundaries despite her escalating appeals, Mom's frustration became obvious. She accused me of becoming cold and uncaring since moving to Portland, suggesting that my new life had made me forget my family obligations. She painted my refusal as betrayal rather than healthy boundary setting, unable to accept that I was no longer available to absorb their emotional chaos. After hanging up, I sat in that coffee shop processing the conversation and marveling at how different my response had been compared to what it would have been a year earlier. The old Maya would have been booking flights before the call ended, driven by guilt and the desperate need to prove her value through service. This Maya understood that love didn't require self-sacrifice, and that healthy families didn't expect one member to abandon their life whenever others faced routine challenges. Over the following days, I received text messages from Ashley and Tyler, each adding their voices to the campaign to bring me home. Ashley's messages were dramatic and emotional, describing how much she needed her sister's support during her traumatic recovery from the accident. Tyler's approach was more practical, suggesting that my graphic design skills could help him create presentations for work while I was visiting. Both siblings seemed genuinely confused by my refusal to drop everything and return to Denver. They'd grown accustomed to my automatic availability and couldn't understand why I was suddenly prioritizing my own commitments over their needs. Their messages revealed how much they'd taken my historical self-sacrifice for granted, assuming It was permanent, rather than a pattern I could choose to change. I responded to each family member with empathy, but maintained my boundaries consistently. I offered Ashley the contact information for excellent therapists in Denver who specialized in anxiety related to car accidents. I sent Tyler resources about managing workplace stress and suggested he speak with his employer's human resources department about available mental health support. For Dad, I researched cardiologists in the Denver area who had excellent reputations for treating blood pressure issues and forwarded their contact information to Mom. I also sent articles about lifestyle changes that could help manage his condition naturally, demonstrating care through practical assistance rather than personal sacrifice. My family's response to my boundary setting was revealing. Instead of appreciating the time I'd spent researching resources and gathering helpful information, they focused entirely on my refusal to provide in-person support. My actual assistance didn't matter if it wasn't delivered in the form they preferred and expected. This dynamic clarified something important about our relationships. They didn't want my help as much as they wanted my compliance. The specific support I could provide was less important than my willingness to abandon my own priorities when they decided they needed me. My value to them was tied to my availability rather than my actual contributions or well-being. As weeks passed, the frequency of their crisis-related communications decreased. Ashley's recovery from her minor accident progressed normally without requiring my intervention. Tyler found a therapist in Denver who helped him develop better stress management strategies. Dad's blood pressure stabilized with medication and lifestyle adjustments that he implemented independently. The family's ability to handle these challenges without my direct involvement proved what I'd suspected. They were perfectly capable of managing their own problems when forced to do so. My historical intervention hadn't been necessary for their well-being. It had simply been convenient for them and validating for me during a time when I equated my worth with my usefulness. During this period, my Portland life continued flourishing in ways that reinforced my decision to maintain boundaries with my family. The tourism campaign I was working on received recognition from Oregon's State Marketing Board, leading to additional project opportunities and a reputation boost within Portland's design community. My weekend hiking group had become a reliable source of friendship and adventure, with members who celebrated each other's professional achievements and provided genuine support during personal challenges. These relationships felt reciprocal in ways my family connections never had, based on mutual interest and respect, rather than inherited obligation and emotional manipulation. I'd also started dating someone I'd met through work, a photographer, named Marcus, who specialized in Pacific Northwest landscapes. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on shared interests and compatible values rather than the desperate need for validation that had characterized my previous romantic connections. Marcus's approach to relationships provided a stark contrast to my family's emotional style. He respected my boundaries automatically, celebrated my professional successes without reservation, and supported my decisions without requiring them to benefit him personally. He demonstrated what healthy love looked like when it wasn't conditional on compliance or self-sacrifice. One evening, as Marcus and I were planning a weekend camping trip to Crater Lake, my phone rang with another call from Mom. This time, her voice carried a different tone, less desperate and more resigned. She'd apparently accepted that I wasn't returning to Denver to manage the family's recent challenges, and the conversation felt more like a genuine check-in than an emotional ambush. She updated me on everyone's progress, acknowledging that they'd all managed their respective situations successfully without requiring my intervention. Ashley had returned to work and was dating someone new who'd been supportive during her accident recovery. Tyler's therapy was helping him develop better work-life balance, and he'd received a promotion that reduced his stress significantly. Dad's blood pressure was well controlled, and his doctor was pleased with his improvement. As Mom shared these updates, I heard something new in her voice, grudging respect for my boundary setting, and perhaps the beginning of understanding that my refusal to rescue them had actually benefited everyone involved. they'd discovered their own resilience and capability when forced to handle challenges independently. Near the end of our conversation, Mom mentioned that the family was planning a vacation to Yellowstone National Park for Dad's birthday in a few months. Almost as an afterthought, she invited me to join them, with the caveat that she understood if I couldn't get time off work or afford the travel expenses. The invitation felt different from previous family gathering requests because it came without pressure or guilt tripping. She seemed genuinely prepared for me to decline without making my decision into a referendum on my love for the family. This new approach suggested that my boundary setting was beginning to reshape how they related to me. I thanked her for the invitation and promised to consider it based on my work schedule and personal preferences. The conversation ended without drama or manipulation, marking a significant shift in our communication patterns. For the first time in memory, I felt like my family was treating me as an autonomous adult rather than an extension of their emotional needs. After hanging up, I realized that my refusal to return to Denver during their recent crisis had accomplished something important. It had forced them to develop coping strategies that didn't rely on my intervention, and it had established new expectations about my availability and role within the family system. They were learning to relate to me as someone who had her own life and priorities, rather than someone whose primary function was managing their comfort and convenience. This evolution felt like progress toward healthier family dynamics, even if it had required significant conflict and disappointment to achieve. Months later, I did join the family for their Yellowstone vacation, but on my own terms and with clear boundaries about my participation. I flew in for 4 days instead of the full week they'd planned, stayed in my own hotel room rather than sharing accommodations, and participated in activities that interested me while declining others that felt obligatory. The trip revealed how much our family dynamics had shifted since my move to Portland. My parents seemed more respectful of my autonomy, asking about my preferences rather than assuming my compliance. Ashley and Tyler treated me more like an equal than a service provider, sharing their own experiences rather than expecting me to focus exclusively on their needs. Most significantly, I enjoyed spending time with them because I was choosing to be there rather than feeling trapped by obligation. The difference between voluntary participation and coercive expectation was transformative for my experience of family relationships. As I returned to Portland after that vacation, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from desperate people-pleaser to confident boundary setter. The car accident and subsequent hospitalization had been traumatic experiences, but they'd also been catalysts for discovering my own worth and learning to prioritize my well-being. My family's abandonment during my medical crisis had initially felt like devastating rejection, but it had ultimately become the greatest gift they could have given me. The opportunity to discover that I was strong enough to handle life's challenges independently and worthy of relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided service. The woman who'd begged for crumbs of attention from people who couldn't be bothered to visit her in the hospital was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that love shouldn't require self-erasure and that healthy relationships enhanced rather than diminished the people involved. Today, I'm designing campaigns for environmental conservation organizations, exploring Oregon's wilderness with people who value my company, and building a life that reflects my actual interests and values rather than inherited family expectations. My relationship with my family has evolved into something more honest and sustainable, based on voluntary connection rather than obligatory compliance. The irony isn't lost on me that their worst behavior during my most vulnerable moment ultimately led to my liberation and their own growth. Sometimes the people who hurt you most end up teaching you exactly what you need to learn about your own worth and what you deserve from relationships. For that unexpected education, I remain grateful. Because the life I'm living now, surrounded by people who show up authentically and celebrate my achievements without reservation, is worth every difficult conversation and boundary-setting confrontation it took to create. A year and a half after leaving Denver, I was standing in the lobby of Portland's convention center, admiring the massive banner displaying my latest campaign for Pacific Northwest tourism. The Discover Your Wild series had exceeded every performance metric, generating a 40% increase in visitor inquiries and earning recognition from the American Advertising Association. Rebecca stood beside me, beaming with pride as conference attendees stopped to photograph the display and discuss the creative strategy behind the campaign. This moment felt surreal compared to where I'd been 18 months earlier, lying in a hospital bed while my family vacationed in Mexico. The woman who'd accepted scraps of attention from people who couldn't prioritize her well-being had been replaced by someone whose work was being celebrated on a national stage. The transformation felt complete, but I knew it was really just the beginning of understanding my own potential when freed from limiting relationships. Marcus squeezed my hand as we watched a group of tourism executives discussing the campaign's innovative approach to environmental messaging. He'd been documenting my professional journey through photography, creating a visual record of achievements that my old self would never have imagined possible. His support felt effortless and genuine, so different from the conditional approval I'd grown accustomed to expecting from people who claimed to love me. Later that evening, as we celebrated at a downtown restaurant with colleagues from Cascade Design Studio, my phone buzzed with a text from Ashley. The message was brief, but significant. Saw your campaign featured in Travel Plus Leisure magazine. Pretty amazing work, sis. Proud of you. The acknowledgement felt genuine rather than obligatory, marking another evolution in how my family had learned to relate to my success. These small gestures of recognition had become more frequent as my professional achievements grew more visible. Tyler had shared one of my environmental campaigns on his LinkedIn profile, adding thoughtful commentary about sustainable tourism practices. Mom had mentioned my work to neighbors and family friends, finally seeming to understand that my career was something worth celebrating rather than tolerating. Even Dad had surprised me by calling after my campaign won a regional design award, asking detailed questions about the creative process and expressing genuine interest in my professional methodology. These conversations felt like discoveries of each other as actual people rather than functional family roles. The shift hadn't happened overnight or without continued boundary maintenance on my part. There had been additional attempts to guilt me into returning for various family events and manufactured emergencies. Each time, I'd maintained my position that love didn't require self-sacrifice, and that healthy families didn't expect one member to abandon their life whenever others faced routine challenges. Gradually, they'd stopped treating my independence as personal rejection and started recognizing it as evidence of my growth and strength. They'd learned to solve their own problems, seek appropriate professional help when needed, and relate to me as someone who had her own valuable life, rather than someone whose primary function was absorbing their emotional chaos. The most significant test had come 8 months earlier, when Tyler had gone through a difficult breakup with his long-term girlfriend. Mom had called asking if I could come home for a weekend to help him through the emotional crisis, painting. A picture of devastating heartbreak that required sisterly intervention. Instead of automatically booking travel, I'd asked more specific questions about Tyler's situation and discovered that he was handling the breakup like a normal adult experiencing normal relationship disappointment. I'd offered to speak with him directly, provided resources for dealing with breakup depression, and suggested he lean on local friends for emotional support during his recovery process. Tyler had initially been surprised by my refusal to drop everything and rush to his aid, but he'd ultimately thanked me for treating him like someone capable of handling his own emotional challenges. Our phone conversations during his recovery had been more honest and reciprocal than any family interactions I could remember, focused on mutual support rather than one-sided service. That experience had marked a turning point in how my family viewed both my boundaries and their own capabilities. They'd begun to understand that my refusal to rescue them wasn't abandonment, but rather confidence in their ability to manage their own lives. This shift had improved not only my relationships with them, but also their relationships with each other. Standing in my Portland apartment now, surrounded by career achievements and healthy relationships, I often thought about the woman I'd been before that car accident. She'd been so desperate for approval that she'd mistaken self-erasure for love, so afraid of abandonment that she'd accepted emotional crumbs as adequate nourishment. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's most selfish behavior had become the catalyst for discovering my own worth. Their abandonment during my medical crisis had forced me to learn that I was strong enough to handle life's challenges independently and valuable enough to demand genuine care from the people in my life. My friendship with Sophia had deepened as she watched me transform from anxious people-pleaser to confident professional. She'd become my witness to the journey, celebrating each milestone and boundary successfully maintained. Our relationship had evolved into something more reciprocal as I'd learned to receive support without feeling guilty and offer help without sacrificing my own well-being. The Portland design community had embraced me as someone worth knowing rather than someone useful to exploit. My colleagues treated my ideas with respect, my professional boundaries with understanding, and my personal life with appropriate curiosity, rather than invasive demands. These relationships felt like examples of what connection could look like when built on mutual interest, rather than inherited obligation. My romantic relationship with Marcus had progressed naturally without the desperate neediness that had characterized my previous dating experiences. He appreciated my independence rather than feeling threatened by it, celebrated my professional success rather than competing with it, and supported my family boundaries rather than pressuring me to compromise them for the sake of keeping peace. We'd been discussing moving in together, a conversation that felt exciting rather than anxiety-provoking, because it was based on genuine compatibility rather than fear of being alone. The woman who'd once clung to any relationship that offered minimal validation had been replaced by someone who understood the difference between loneliness and solitude, between love and convenience. 6 months earlier, I'd received an unexpected call from a headhunter representing a major advertising agency in Seattle. They'd seen my Pacific Northwest tourism work and wanted to discuss a creative director position that would represent another significant career advancement. The salary offer was substantial, the creative opportunities were compelling, and the team seemed genuinely excited about my potential contributions. For the first time in my professional life, I'd been able to consider a job opportunity purely on its merits, rather than worrying about how my decision would affect other people's convenience or comfort. I'd negotiated confidently, asked for additional professional development opportunities, and ultimately accepted a position that aligned perfectly with my career goals and personal values. The move to Seattle had felt like another step in my ongoing journey of choosing growth over comfort, adventure over security. My family had responded with resignation rather than resistance, having learned that their approval wasn't required for my decision-making process. They'd even expressed pride in my continued professional advancement, finally seeming to understand that my success reflected well on all of us. Marcus had decided to relocate with me, finding freelance photography opportunities in Seattle that matched his interests in environmental and outdoor recreation documentation. Our relationship had proven strong enough to handle major life transitions, built on solid foundations of mutual respect and shared values, rather than desperate attachment or convenient familiarity. My new position at the Seattle agency had exceeded every expectation, with creative challenges that pushed my skills in exciting directions and a team culture that valued innovation over conformity. I'd been given lead responsibility for a major sustainability campaign targeting younger demographics, work that felt meaningful as well as professionally rewarding. The campaign's success had led to speaking opportunities at design conferences, industry recognition that felt validating without being necessary for my self-worth, and professional relationships that opened doors to additional creative opportunities. My career had become a source of genuine satisfaction rather than desperate validation seeking. Recently, I'd been invited to speak at a conference in Denver about sustainable design practices, my first professional return to the city I'd left behind. The invitation felt symbolic, representing how completely my relationship with that place had transformed from site of trauma to location of professional opportunity. I'd accepted the speaking engagement and planned to visit with my family while in town, curious to experience our evolved dynamic in the physical space where our old patterns had been established. The prospect felt exciting rather than anxiety-provoking, because I was returning as a visitor rather than someone seeking approval or acceptance. My parents had expressed genuine excitement about my speaking opportunity, asking thoughtful questions about my presentation topic, and mentioning my visit to friends and neighbors with obvious pride. Their enthusiasm felt authentic rather than performative, suggesting that they'd genuinely learned to celebrate my achievements rather than feeling threatened by my independence. Ashley had volunteered to attend my conference presentation, expressing genuine curiosity about my work and professional development since leaving Denver. Tyler had asked if we could have dinner during my visit, wanting to hear about my Seattle experience and share updates about his own career progression. These interactions felt like gifts after years of relationships characterized by obligation and emotional manipulation. My family had learned to relate to me as someone worth knowing rather than someone useful to exploit, and I'd learned to engage with them from a position of strength rather than desperate neediness. The woman who'd once begged for crumbs of attention from people who couldn't be bothered to visit her in the hospital had discovered that she deserved relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been absolutely necessary for discovering who she could become when freed from limiting beliefs about her own worth. As I prepared for my Denver speaking engagement, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from desperate people pleaser to confident professional. The car accident had been traumatic, but it had also been the catalyst for discoveries about my own resilience and value that might never have emerged under different circumstances. My family's abandonment during my medical crisis had initially felt like devastating rejection, but it had ultimately become the foundation for building a life based on authentic relationships and genuine self-respect. They'd inadvertently taught me that I was strong enough to handle life's challenges independently and worthy of love that didn't require self-sacrifice. The irony wasn't lost on me that their worst behavior had led to the best possible outcome for everyone involved. My boundary setting had forced them to develop healthier coping strategies and more realistic expectations about family relationships. They'd learned to value my presence because it was voluntary rather than obligatory, and I'd learned to enjoy their company because it enhanced rather than diminished my well-being. Today, I'm designing campaigns that promote environmental consciousness, while building a life that reflects my actual values and interests. My relationship with my family has evolved into something honest and sustainable, based on mutual respect rather than inherited obligation. My romantic relationship provides genuine partnership rather than desperate attachment. Most importantly, I've discovered that the life I'd always dreamed of was possible once I stopped accepting relationships that required me to make myself small. The woman who'd spent 26 years trying to earn love from people who weren't capable of giving it unconditionally had been replaced by someone who understood exactly what she deserved and refused to settle for less. Looking back, I can see that my family's abandonment during my hospital stay was actually the greatest gift they could have given me. It forced me to discover my own strength and showed me exactly what kind of relationships I wanted to build. Going forward, sometimes the people who hurt you most end up teaching you the most important lessons about your own worth and potential. For that unexpected education, delivered in the most painful way possible, I remain genuinely grateful. Because the life I'm living now, surrounded by people who celebrate my achievements and support my growth, is worth every difficult conversation and boundary-setting confrontation it took to create. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.